Two of my exes both described me as a tortured soul, and that is how I felt. But now, looking back, there was a lot of suffering, but I see that it was infused with grace that has allowed me to, in a way, feel like I've won the cosmic lottery. So I wanted to share my story and how I kind of got to this point. So let's start not quite at the beginning, but early enough in my childhood. And when I was a boy, between the ages of around, particularly around 6 to 10, I think, I used to have these sort of night terrors, but they weren't necessarily at night. I used to get them. I used to get tonsillitis a lot. And I used to have these weird things come on where it was like my mind really opened up. And whenever I've described it in the past, I've described it being like the story of Sisyphus pushing a rock up the mountain. And when the rock gets near the top of the mountain, it rolls back down. So that element of eternal damnation. So I feel like it was, well, I now know, because it came up recently for me to experience again, that those were mystical experiences that were utterly overwhelming, where I was tapping into or opening up to the truth of eternity, really. And it was terrifying. And my sister, who I spoke to about it not that long ago, who's older than me, said that it was like I was seeing things. My parents would have to put a cold flannel on my forehead. And I remember being in our living room and being so terrified and overwhelmed by this experience that I wanted to throw myself out of the window. And I was only a boy. And we had no idea what was going on. And, once I got towards my teenage years, it started to calm down. That said, I even remember the house we live in now, which we moved into in the beginning of 2019. I remember once being stood in the kitchen and having that same experience of everything just opening up, only this time it wasn't so overwhelming. It was just odd. And like I said, these experiences very much came to the fore again, just before my recent shift, my recent awakening. So I'll come back to that. But, in hindsight, those experiences as a boy were very telling. Also, I grew up in a fairly fractious environment. Now, I love my family deeply, and I don't think my parents would deny that that is the case, that it was quite a tempestuous environment. There was a reasonable amount of disgruntlement, conflict even, particularly between my parents. And, I do talks on, for example, when I do corporate talks or I work with teams, I always am trying to look at ways to get this understanding in, but in a way that's not going to put people off. So a couple of ways I do that. Number one is obviously through my background in sports broadcasting, through flow. And another is through left and right brain insights. And the left brain insight is that we have that voice in the head that's always just coming up with stories and narratives. It's the left brain interpreter. It's trying to make sense of what's happening inside, but also make sense of what's happening outside, but also inside. And so for my parents, I would say that they have basically had the same argument for my whole life. And that argument on the surface might look different. What they focus on is different, but really underneath the left brain interpretation, left brain storytelling around what's going on it's their own attachment wounds. My mother would be more on the anxious side of things, or had some abandonment stuff growing up, and so that can easily get triggered. And my father's more on the closed down. Perhaps there was an element of engulfment, I don't know, but that's the dynamic. I didn't know this at the time. I only have sort of really recognized this, over the last however many years, but certainly not, this wasn't what I knew growing up. All I knew was that it was difficult to be around for my sister and myself. And I remember once sitting on the stairs and hearing an argument going on, and I remember thinking to myself, I don't know why I don't feel more. I feel more scared or whatever. And the reason in hindsight was because I was up in my head. Because when we're young and we don't have all the distractions that, for example, are so prevalent now, the easiest way to escape our feelings is to go into our head. And that's something I see with the people I work with. It's our first defense mechanism, is to avoid our feelings by going up into our head. And that's absolutely something I learned. So I grew up in an environment like that, that was, I was on, there was certainly a high degree of hyper alertness. So that's another bit of context. And I remember as well, another important thing, when I was a boy, about 9 or 7, maybe 7, 8, 9, looking in the mirror and like just being transfixed, thinking, God, like, is that me? And looking at this face and looking so, I just couldn't believe this was me. Now, of course, the insight is it's not me. But I really remember going through that transition of, wow, like, that doesn't feel like me. That doesn't look like I think, but I identify with this face and obviously with the body. At school, I was very naughty, not in a bad, like, doing anything bad, just very gobby. A lot of people have said gift of the gab type stuff. So I was always getting in trouble for talking back to teachers, and I can illustrate this from when I was 11 years old. I had 10 sets of lines from teachers, and if you got 11 sets of lines, you had to see the headmaster with your parents. And I was terrified of that fact. And so I went to geography on a Friday, and I couldn't find my homework. And I remember getting really deeply upset about it. Long story short, I faked illness. For the one and only time I've done that, I said I had a stomach ache. So I got sent to the school nurse or whatever it was. The school nurse rang my mum. My mum took me to the doctor. The doctor said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I got a stomach ache." He pressed me in my tummy, said, "Does that hurt?" And he was pressing quite hard, and it did hurt. And he said, "I think you got appendicitis." So I was operated on that night. So I lied to get off school and ended up having surgery, which is pretty mad in hindsight. And it, at the time I rationalized it for a long time afterwards. Oh, thank goodness I faked illness. I was obviously ill, and it was only much later I realized, no, there was nothing wrong with me at all. But this was in the time when, it was, I suppose medicine was a lot more basic. Anyway, so there was, a degree of disquiet from an early age. My outlet was tennis. I fell in love with tennis. So playing tennis, watching the Wimbledon video that my mum got me each year, that was my access to presence. That was my escape. And I absolutely love tennis. And if anyone asked me what I wanted to do, it would have been to be a journalist at Wimbledon, which I ended up doing many years later. Then another key moment for me came when I was 15 years old. I had a relatively quite a serious relationship at a young age, and I went out with someone for a year and a half. And long story short, she ended up breaking my heart and leaving, or should we say, having a fling with someone close to me behind my back. And it was devastating for me, and my heart shut. So I was very open-hearted when I was younger, and then around that time, my heart just shut. And it stayed shut until, I gradually, through work I did, sort of opened things up. And then I discovered weed when I was about 16, 17, which became like a comfort blanket for me for many years after. And I understand now why. It was like getting a hug that perhaps in other ways I didn't feel like I was getting. So that was going on. Then I went to university, yada, yada. Let's skip forward a little bit. And, I knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be in broadcasting. One of my first jobs was doing crowd warm up for Robot Wars, if anyone remembers that. And then, I got back. I was a journalist. I wrote for a tennis magazine for a while, and then got into local radio, starting out in Ipswich, then Virgin Radio, now Absolute, onto the BBC. So I was working at the BBC from 2010 on Radio 1, and I felt like, I'd made it, and it was an amazing job. And I was so fortunate, at that time, for me, in terms of tennis, to cover Roger Federer, Andy Murray, but also I was at the Euros in Ukraine in 2012, World Cup 2014, all these different events. Even though tennis is really the only sport that really, I loved. My father was a Scottish rugby fanatic. Anyway, so I really felt like I had made it. But then around that time, I was having real anxiety, particularly insomnia. I could easily, it was just hitting me a lot. So I was up and down. And I remember people I worked with, there was one girl I remember saying, like, you are very up and down. So I could be like on form, which was important to me. But then I would have these kind of crashes and, deep insecurity and anxiety coming up. And so it was really hard riding this wave. And I felt like, I felt quite different in that sense, that there was a lot of suffering, and I'd started on the self-improvement journey actually in about 2005 with things like NLP, but it was in 2013 when I was having just the repeating issues in relationships, and I had this very clear understanding in terms of family dynamics that nothing was. I was trying to control other people to change, which would never work, and I saw this very clearly that, I had to change myself, or rather change my role within the dynamic. And that to me was the key moment, because there was this clear seeing and then a surrender. Everything after that, I can really trace through to the awakening shift I had. So from that surrender, I started doing inner child work, which was really, really important for me, learning about not abandoning yourself, about loving yourself, about taking responsibility for your feelings, having an intention to come from love, not fear. Really, this is the work I talk about a lot. Samskaras, so dealing with our feelings, our patterns, our issues, because it's our samskaras that are in the way of the gold that is our true nature. And one thing at this time kind of led to another, until I met a guy who told me about ayahuasca, and I went and did ayahuasca in 2015. And I felt very cool to do it, and I was terrified, rightly so, and it absolutely kicked my ass. And I had an experience of non-duality. I laughed to the point where I thought I was going to die of laughing, moments of absolute terror. And I purged, not in the classic ayahuasca sense of through the mouth or anywhere else, but through sound. So there was this deep guttural moaning and screaming even that was coming through me, not by me. And I used to feel anxiety in my solar plexus. And this energetic hole just got released by ayahuasca. And this hole kind of for weeks even afterwards, like gradually closed back down, but it was extremely discombobulating. And I had told colleagues I was doing it. And I remember one guy saying that for weeks afterwards, it's like I drifted into the office. They were quite worried about me. And it was only when I sought out integration that perhaps I sort of settled things down. And then I had the post ayahuasca glow for several months, until that Christmas 2015, when I put down some boundaries with people close to me, and that's when all of a sudden all of these feelings were coming up that had previously, caused things like, I've been told I had IBS and so irritable bowel, and I was having gut issues, and I was always bloated. But once I'd had that release from my solar plexus, there wasn't this blockage. And so when I put this boundary down in Christmas 2015, all of a sudden, all this emotion came up. A lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of shame, like crying. I couldn't believe how easily I was crying. And this went on for months and months, where I was just so much emotion was coming up. So in hindsight, and I've talked about this in another video, I feel like that was quite dark night of the soul-esque. It was very, very challenging. But once I passed through it, that's when I met Alex. And obviously, as I've said, I feel like with Alex and myself, quite yin and yang, both quite fiery, and the work we've done together has also been of fundamental importance. And I often talk about relationships in this way because one of my favorite quotes is an Eckhart Tolle quote of, if we accept the relationships are not here to make us happy, they're here to make us conscious. I think that's absolutely spot on, because Alex and I had that honeymoon phase, but we did trigger each other, and it was by turning towards that and saying to Alex that I couldn't repeat what I'd had as a child or what I'd experienced as a child, a combative relationship in that way, because my nervous system couldn't handle it. I wasn't someone who could have conflict and then go to sleep. I already battled insomnia and had these kind of ups and downs and attacks where all of a sudden I'd just be hit by a lot of emotion and shame and, like nervous system collapse even on occasion. I was like, I had to take a loving action and be with someone who was willing to go on and do that work with me. And Alex absolutely was. So, I've spoken about that before, like the work we do and not separating our spiritual work, whether that meditation or whatever it might be, psychedelics or whatever it is, from everyday life. Like life really is the teacher. And certainly relationships are wonderful for that. So I got a hell of a lot in terms of development, as did my wife, from our relationship. And then alongside that was just, particularly after ayahuasca, so drawn to non-duality. When I was, I forgot to say, so I've covered Wimbledon every year from 2007 to 2024, radio and TV. And after ayahuasca 2015, I had this deep sense of that sport was not my calling, and that it was more on the spiritual side and philosophical side. And I was in this deep torment of like, how could I be so in the wrong lane? But when I really launched my podcast in 2018 and then wrote my book, which is here, Flow, I realized actually sport is this beautiful spiritual experience, because we think it's about winning or trophies, but actually flow, which is so obvious in sport, the beautiful thing about flow is losing our sense of self. It's not the trophy. It is those moments when we are one with the universal flow. That's when the beautiful moments happen. That's when we feel our best. And so sport is very revealing. It's just the ego comes and says, it's about trophies. It's about my team versus your team. It's not. I'm very clear on that. And fortunately with that led me to be able to do interviews, particularly, I did one with Rupert, and then Rupert asked me to do interviews with him, with Bernardo and Donald and Tom Campbell and all these people. And, my hyper focus, which had been on tennis from around 2015 onwards, really went to non-duality and spirituality. And I just absolutely immersed myself in it, whether that be reading, obviously starting with something obvious like Eckhart Tolle, through to Nisargadatta, to Ramana Maharshi, to Michael Singer, to Zen stuff, Thich Nhat Hanh, like all of it. I just was absolutely immersed, watching all sorts of YouTube stuff, reading stuff, different practices. I did the 8-week mindfulness-based reduction course, so really got into just concentration meditation, then mantra meditation. But the one that really moved the needle for me was self-inquiry. And my favorite, I would say, spiritual book from a technical point of view is Gary Weber's book, which is Happiness Beyond Thought. Now, Gary Weber, I'm fascinated by Gary because he discovered the work of Ramana Maharshi, and the essence of his work obviously is just working with self-inquiry and the question, who am I? And Gary, through self-inquiry, allied with some yoga and a bit of chanting, basically came out of a yoga pose once and his mind just quiet. So he had an awakening, and And I loved the way his book was so clear in terms of, if you work with self-inquiry. And for me, because you could say I'm neurodiverse, I got diagnosed with ADHD. I was patron of the ADHD Foundation for a long time. I'm not someone who I tended to jump around a little bit, but self-inquiry was something that really landed for me. And so I worked with that was always something I came back to, because the thing I like about self-inquiry as well is, as well as doing it in a meditative setting, for example, after doing some breath meditation to calm down and then dropping a self-inquiry question in, whether that be who am I, what am I, where am I, you can do it anytime throughout the day. Just who am I? And listen. And so that was what really eventually shifted the needle. And then, in the weeks and months, or even the year leading up to my shift, I had a lot of stuff come up. So I recorded a video. I'll link to it somewhere here. It's only a couple of months ago where I had this sudden bout of shame come up, like hugely overwhelming wave of shame that I knew to not resist. Like, I just really embraced it, and I recorded a video and released it. And to me, all this stuff coming up shortly before my shift is no coincidence. Did various other things. I did a really powerful tapping session with someone called Sarah, who I'm really good friends with. Reiki stuff with Alex that we'll talk about another time, where the Reiki I did with Alex, it was like psychedelics. Like, it was just so energetically cleansing. And then, done all my interviews with some people, for example, who I can just tell is in that place. And I do think there's a transmission element. I'll name some names. There's Gary Weber. I haven't put our interview out because the audio was terrible. I'll maybe release a clip. So Gary Weber, Lisa Cairns, Angelo DeLulo, a guy called Vern Lovick, who also refuses to come on, but he's definitely had a shift. And I do sense with the people I've mentioned, like, there is a stillness and a centeredness that is very palpable. And then I got invited on the retreat, which I will be speaking about. And the essence of the retreat was working with the koan, or the self-inquiry question, who am I? And so I stayed with that question very deeply. And then the terror that, for example, I felt as a kid in those mystical experiences came up. All sorts of stuff came up just before the shift happened. And the shift was not anything like I could imagine. Yet at the same time, it was just so clear that separation is an illusion, and it was so infused with love. It was so beautiful that it was incredible. And and it's now, however, like nearly 4 and a bit weeks, so still not long, but like, even though the energy settled and the bliss is settled, that centeredness, that stillness is absolutely there. If anything, that is deepening all the time. It's so delicious. I wouldn't change it for all the money in the world. I wouldn't change it for anything. It honestly is like I've won the lottery, but the cosmic lottery. But this isn't me, right? This is all of our true nature, and our samskaras, which is the other work I talk about, that is what's blocking it. But then the paradox, of course, is I look back on everything I've just said to you, and I realized it was all just happening, and it was all grace. So that sense of I'm a tortured soul, I'm so grateful for the challenges I had, for the anxiety, for the bouts of depression, for the shame, for all of that, because it was grace showing up in a way to allow this to come through. So I'm so grateful for every second of it. And of course, I see it was all just happening. There is no doer, but there is that paradox, no doer, but at the same time, until you see that, and even after you see that, still do the work. So I just wanted to share kind of my story. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if any parts of my story resonated, or just let me know what you think. And if you have anything that you'd like me to talk about in an upcoming video, I'd love to hear it. And thank you for watching. Lots of love.